Good day to everyone, wherever you may happen to be. My name is Jonathan Wolfe, Joe Wolfe, and I'm the co-organizer of the conference with Shelley, who will be our first speaker for today. I'm a white man, graying hair swept back, roundish glasses, still wearing many layers of cardigans and sweatshirts in a rather cold London, and sitting in a room with a few plants on the windowsill and light streaming in from the window. It's my great pleasure to welcome those who are new and welcome people back to this fourth day of what I think has been a really amazing conference so far, and I'm sure we will carry on in a similar spirit today. Just to remind you of a few things, if you would like to use the subtitling, we have the CC button at the bottom for live transcript, and it gives you some forms of adjusting the font size and other options there. We'll ask you to put your questions into the Q&A, and you can do that at any time that the speaker is talking, so you get to the front of the queue when the questions come up. And we also have a function that allows you to upvote a question. So if there's a question you particularly would like to see answered, if there are many there and you want it at the top of the list, then you can upvote it. We will be having a conference social at the end, where what we will do is move everyone to a different Zoom room so we can have a chat, see the faces of people who, unfortunately, because of the webinar forum, we only see your names at this point as panelists and each other. So if you're still around at the end of the day, or at the end of the afternoon, or end of the morning, whatever it is for you, then do feel free to join us, although we do understand people have other commitments too. So without further ado, I'll pass over to Verena, who will chair the first session.
Thank you very much. Good morning. Good morning from Syracuse, New York, which is where it's morning, 8 o'clock now. My name is Verena Erlenbusch Anderson. I'm a white woman with about chin length brown hair that's starting to show some gray. I'm in my home. You can see behind me some plants, some posters on the walls, and some books on the shelves. I work at Syracuse University, where I teach courses in political theory, contemporary political philosophy, and feminist philosophy. And in my courses, I also teach philosophy of disability, which I don't write about myself, but I'm very interested in. And it's my distinct pleasure today to introduce Shelley Tremain, in particular, from whose scholarship and activism both myself, but also my students, have been very fortunate to learn. Shelley Tremain works on a range of topics, including philosophy of disability, Michel Foucault, feminist philosophy, ableism in philosophy, social metaphysics and epistemology, and biopolitics and bioethics. Shelley is the author of the really terrific book, Foucault and Feminist Philosophy of Disability, which won the Tobin Siebers Prize for Disability Studies in the Humanities. And she's also the editor of Foucault and the Government of Disability and the forthcoming Bloomsbury Guide to Philosophy of Disability. Shelley also coordinates, edits, and produces Dialogues in Disability, which is a groundbreaking series of interviews with disabled philosophers. And these interviews appear on the third Wednesday of every month on the blog Biopolitical Philosophy. And in addition to that, as if that were not already a lot, Shelley is also a principal investigator for Canada's National Policy Research Institute to promote the human rights of disabled people. Her talk today is titled New Movement in Philosophy, Philosophy of Disability. Shelley, your microphone is off.
Thank you. Sorry about that. Thank you very much for that kind introduction, Verena. I'm very happy that you're here joining us today. I want to give a self-description. I'm a white woman with short, graying, messy hair, and it has a little barrette in it. I am wearing plastic glasses, black plastic glasses. Behind me, on my right, there's a window through which light is entering the room, and it's a curtained window. And on my left, up above, there's a ceiling fan. I want to give a land acknowledgement. I'm joining the conference from land that is the ancestral territory of the Haudenosaunee and Anishinaabe nations. The territory was the subject of the Dish with One Spoon Wampum Belt Covenant, an agreement between the Iroquois Confederacy and the Ojibwe and allied nations around the Great Lakes. As a settler, I want to humbly offer my presentation with respect for and in solidarity with Indigenous peoples of Turtle Island and other colonized settler states who, for thousands of years, have held sacred the land, water, and air, as well as their inhabitants, and who for centuries have protected them from the ravages of colonialism and expropriation. I want to give what I'm going to do today is I'm going to read part of the introduction to the Bloomsbury Guide to Philosophy of Disability. I thought that would be appropriate since a number of the presentations throughout the conference are based upon chapters that will appear in the book. So I thought that I would present the introduction, and I'm going to read part of the introduction that sort of provides a context for the book in general. I won't read the part in which I do an overview of the chapters unless you would prefer me to read that as opposed to answer questions. I want to draw, first of all, attention to the title of the chapter of the introduction, which is New Movement as opposed to A New Movement. So I'm sort of riffing on bell hooks there. So the first section of the introduction is situating philosophy of disability in/out of philosophy. This collection comprises 26 bold new essays that mark the emergence and coalescence of an insurgent subdiscipline of academic philosophy that I years ago initiated and to which I gave the name Philosophy of Disability. As the contributions to the collection variously illustrate, specialists in this quote-unquote emerging subfield of philosophy do the following. One, they examine how philosophy produces and puts into circulation misrepresentations of the phenomena of disability and enhances existing misrepresentations of these phenomena. Two, they advance arguments and explanations about how critical and oppositional analyses of disability are marginalized in philosophy, if not entirely excluded from it. Three, they advance arguments and explanations about how disabled philosophers and disabled philosophers of disability in particular are vastly underrepresented in the profession. And four, they articulate up-to-date understandings of disability that construe it as an irreducibly social and political affair. In other words, philosophy of disability, one, identifies and interrogates how disability has historically been produced, represented, and addressed, when at all, within the discipline of philosophy and the broader social milieu. Two, it scrutinizes how its own ineluctably critical approach to disability is marginalized in some areas of philosophy and entirely excluded from other areas of the discipline. Three, documents how disabled philosophers of disability are virtually absent from permanent positions in the profession. And four, offers novel counter discourses about disability that refuse the strategic naturalization and depoliticization of disability by and through the institutional, professional, and disciplinary practices that constitute the sedimented scaffolding of philosophy. Mainstream non-disabled philosophy continues to operate under the guise of neutrality, rationality, and objectivity. Nevertheless, the discipline of philosophy, like every one of the traditional disciplines that constitutes the modern university, both implicitly and explicitly promotes certain ontologies, methodologies, and epistemologies. That is, certain political, social, economic, cultural, and institutional mechanisms condition philosophy and every other discipline of the modern university, even though conventional established disciplines such as philosophy continue to be represented and to variously represent themselves as value neutral, detached, disinterested, and impartial. Over the past several decades, and in the last several years especially, philosophers who are institutionally, politically, and socially subordinated have steadily challenged the white, cisgender, heteronormative androcentrism of philosophy, persistently working to forge new paths for the discipline. For example, a number of feminist philosophy journals and societies have been created. Summer schools and institutes have proliferated that provide mentoring and other support to racialized, to LGBTQ+ and working class philosophy students. Professional philosophy associations increasingly fund projects that promote the interests of underrepresented philosophy faculty. And more philosophy conferences prioritize the contributions of members of underrepresented groups in philosophy while spotlighting marginalized areas of philosophical research. Despite resistance and outright hostility from certain corners of philosophy, furthermore, an increasing number of philosophy departments offer courses in feminist philosophy, philosophy of race, queer theory, Latinx philosophy, and other areas of inquiry that defy previously accepted ideas about what counts as philosophy and who counts as a philosopher. The subject matter of these courses is designed to transform the discipline of philosophy by subverting the heterosexism, racism, Eurocentrism, homophobia, and transphobia embedded in the claims of mainstream philosophers, by critiquing the methods and foundational assumptions of Eurocentric Western philosophy along these lines, and by introducing alternative discursive practices, methodologies, and thinkers into the so-called canon of philosophy. Indeed, some philosophers now deliberately utilize the aforementioned areas of inquiry to redress the Eurocentrism, androcentrism, and whiteness of the discipline of philosophy, as well as to ameliorate the historical underrepresentation of some groups of philosophers within their own respective departments and the profession of philosophy more generally. Notwithstanding the ways in which these measures have begun to shift relations of power in the discipline and profession, philosophy of disability and disabled philosophers continue to be systematically left out of many of these initiatives or haphazardly added to them based on assumptions about inclusion and diversity that take gender and race, understood as mutually exclusive, to be paradigmatic categories of identity and subjection, effectively depoliticizing disability and obscuring the distinct ways that disabled philosophers are subjected in philosophy and the myriad ways that disability and ableism complicate constructions of gender and race. Thus, this collection aspires to intervene and disrupt the unsatisfactory dimensions of many measures that have been introduced to diversify the discipline and profession. One of the features that philosophy of disability has in common with philosophy of gender and philosophy of race, as well as with other oppositional and counter discourses in the university, is a central reliance on the tools of social constructionism and hence an implicit critique of essentialism. Although philosophers of disability disagree about what disability is, as well as how and the extent to which disability is socially constructed, assumptions about the social constitution of disability more or less lie at the heart of philosophy of disability. That is, regardless of how much practitioners of this relatively recent subfield of philosophical inquiry otherwise disagree, they concur with each other insofar as they assume that disability is not a natural state of affairs that exists apart from historically contingent relations of social power. In other words, philosophers of disability provide insights that talk back to the dominant conceptualization of disability that is constitutive of bioethics, cognitive science, and mainstream political philosophy and ethics especially, according to which disability is a natural, i.e. prediscursive, deficit, personal misfortune, or pathology that inevitably leads to the social, economic, and political disadvantages that disabled people confront. Indeed, the questions that mainstream philosophers have asked and continue to ask about disability rely upon a cluster of motivational assumptions that take for granted the metaphysical status and epistemological character of disability, casting it as a self-evident and hence philosophically uninteresting designation that science and medicine can accurately represent. On the terms of this cluster of assumptions, disability is a transcultural and transhistorical disadvantage, an objective human defect, that is, a non-accidental biological human property, attribute, or characteristic that ought to be prevented, corrected, eliminated, or cured. That these assumptions are contestable, that disability might be a historically and culturally specific and contingent social phenomenon, a complex apparatus of power rather than a natural attribute or a property that certain people possess, is not considered, let alone seriously entertained. Insofar as practitioners of the Euro-American philosophical tradition have, with few exceptions, cast disability as a natural, negative, and inert state of affairs, they have largely removed disability from the realm of philosophical inquiry, precluding it from serious scrutiny and keeping at bay philosophical debate and questioning about its epistemological, ethical, ontological, and political status. The marginalization and exclusion from philosophical discourse of urgent social and political matters with respect to disability and the COVID-19 pandemic are a case in point. Mainstream philosophical discourse about the pandemic has disregarded the structural ableism, poverty, isolation, and other social disadvantages and inequities that have increasingly accrued to disabled people during the pandemic, uniformly attributing these consequences of the pandemic and its effects to an inherent natural vulnerability that resides in disabled people themselves, rather than to the neoliberal policies and practices that have fostered or exacerbated these disadvantages and inequities. When, over the course of the pandemic, philosophers have, if at all, considered the phenomena that they perceive to constitute disability, they have sequestered these phenomena in the domain, I've lost my spot. In the domain of bioethics, as is routinely done in philosophy when issues that pertain to disability arise, and have directed their attention almost singularly to questions and claims that medicalize and individualize disability, including questions and claims about the development of triage protocols for supposedly scarce healthcare goods and resources, questions and claims about whether disabled people can justifiably retain their ventilators if COVID-19 hospital units require them, and questions and claims about which disabled people in which countries should or should not be prioritized for vaccination. Nevertheless, philosophy of disability, a widening body of critical philosophical work, denaturalizes disability and in doing so, politicizes the broad range of phenomena with respect to disability that non-disabled philosophers either naturalize and omit from serious consideration or misrepresent in ways that detrimentally affect disabled people, including the phenomena that have characterized the COVID-19 pandemic, the naturalization and depoliticization of risk, the vulnerabilization of disabled people and elders confined to nursing homes and other congregate settings, and the neoliberal privatization of responsibility for transmission of the virus itself. The next section is entitled, What Philosophy of Disability Isn't? The publication of the Bloomsbury Guide to Philosophy of Disability undermines elements of the status quo in philosophy that naturalize and medicalize disability, regardless of whether they congeal and manifest in mainstream philosophy or in underrepresented oppositional philosophies, by introducing a substantial corpus of critical philosophical work designed to both subvert deleterious philosophical arguments about disability and destabilize the pervasive social and political discourses about disability from which disability philosophy draws and to which it contributes. In contradistinction to mainstream philosophy, that is, philosophy of disability represents itself as politically motivated in character and socially engaged in content. Like other oppositional and progressive discourses within the university, philosophy of disability has grown out of and remains associated with cultural movement for social justice. Oh gosh, I've lost my place again. Sorry, I have the hand restrictions right now, so I'm a different part of my computer. Okay. And with cultural movement for social justice that endeavors to unsettle the status quo of current institutional, political, economic, and social arrangements and the power relations that comprise them, reproduce them, and sustain them. One of the motivational assumptions of the collection is, therefore, the contention that the incorporation of certain treatments of disability, certain analytic treatments of disability, especially bioethical treatments of it, under the rubric of philosophy of disability, constrains the radical potential of this area of inquiry. Indeed, these quote-unquote applications of analytic philosophy to disability serve in a variety of ways to reinstate conventional relations of power with respect to disability. In other words, the motivational assumptions of this new subfield, namely philosophy of disability, are distinct from the assumptions that motivate mainstream philosophical stances on disability, according to which disability is a prediscursive human trait or characteristic, a natural flaw or defect that can be adequately and appropriately addressed in the subfield of bioethics and cognate areas of inquiry. The motivational assumptions of philosophy of disability are, moreover, importantly different from the presuppositions that inspire inquiry about disability, whose terms of reference are framed as mutually exclusive, passionately associated with each other through an ampersand, that is, as philosophy and disability, rather than purposively implicated in each other through a preposition, that is, as philosophy of disability. Within the terms of the former frame, philosophy and disability, disability is positioned as an object upon which philosophy sets its overbearing inquisitional gaze, a gaze whose primary interests remain the questions and concerns about disability that white, heterosexual, and property mainstream Western and Northern philosophers have generated largely under the rubric of bioethics. Within the terms of the latter frame, philosophy of disability, by contrast, the ways in which philosophers inquire into the phenomena of disability is assumed to are assumed to significantly contribute to the very constitution and reproduction of disability, to the ways in which causation with respect to disability is understood, to how the effects of disability are represented, as well as to the constitution, consolidation, representation, and reproduction of philosophy itself. As the philosophers as the authors in this collection demonstrate, the discursive practices that philosophers use to represent disability, the context in which various forms of representation of disability take place, and the assumptions that underlie the rationale offered for why and how representation takes place as such, are fundamental mechanisms of the apparatuses of disability and ableism, materializing the contingent phenomena that they comprise, elaborating their parameters, specifying their delineation, and so on. An astute philosophy of disability takes for granted that its central terms of reference are mutually constitutive. Whoops. Sorry, I've lost my place again. That underlie the rationale offered for why and how representation takes place as such are fundamental mechanisms of the apparatus of disability and ableism, materializing the contingent phenomena that they comprise, elaborating their parameters, specifying their delineation, and so on. An astute philosophy of disability takes for granted that its central terms of reference are mutually constitutive and mutually reinforcing, entangled and entwined. Insofar as a certain strand of philosophers who write about disability have for the most part concentrated on the formulation of responses to a normative agenda that their predominantly non-disabled and white mainstream philosophy interlocutors have essentially determined for them, critical philosophical inquiry about/of disability has remained wedded to an ableist, racist, speciesist, and heterosexist agenda. That is, inasmuch as these philosophers have primarily confined their analyses of disability to, for example, normative concerns with respect to debate between outdated conceptions of justice and care, the most suitable account of distributed justice for disabled people, and questions about the well-being and quality of life of disabled people, all of which matters with respect to disability their interlocutors in mainstream analytic philosophy initiated in the first place. Examination of the metaphysical and epistemological status of disability has been neglected. Naturalization and materialization of disability have expanded in new directions. In certain areas of the discipline, the historical emergence of disability and its contingency have remained obscured. Denial persists about how certain ontological and ethical commitments condition ableist segregation of the profession, and the ways that disability is intertwined with other apparatuses of power, including settler colonialism, white supremacy, class animality, and cis heteronormativity, have gone almost entirely unaddressed. This collection has been configured to move philosophical work about/on disability beyond and outside of the artifactual parameters of research that much heretofore philosophical analyses with respect to disability had erected. Okay, I was going to go on, but I see that I'm running short of time, so I'll stop there and take your questions, or I can give the overview if you prefer that rather than questions and answers. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Shelley, for a really rich and terrific presentation. Let's open it up to questions. You can put them in the Q&A box at the bottom of your screen.
I'm just going to take a look at what's in the chat. Oh, Jamie has given instructions. Thank you, Jamie.
Okay, so I don't see any questions in the Q&A yet, but Joe has a question.
Thank you. So, I mean, it's really interesting to see this, Shelley. What reaction do you expect to it? I mean, do you think there will be a backlash, or do you think people are ready to hear what you're doing now?
Are you referring to the collection in general or my introduction?
So I think your introduction was very measured. I think that, and although that there is a sort of provocative undercurrent, I think people can read through and will probably agree. But if the contributions are like the very powerful and very unusual papers we've had over the last few days, there is something collectively very provocative about the collection. So I'm wondering what you anticipate. So there'll be, suppose the book is reviewed in a mainstream philosophy journal. How do you think it will be received?
I think that in a mainstream philosophy journal, well, that depends which journal we're talking about. But I think that, and depends who the reviewer is. If it's a mainstream philosopher, I think that there will be possibly questions about, why certain questions that philosophers have asked about disability aren't included in the book, and why they aren't covered. And if it's someplace like I don't know, Hypatia, I think that the reviews will be quite favorable. Perhaps.
Yeah. So perhaps I can come back a bit. So if I was naive in the field of disability, philosophy of disability, and was a book review editor, I suppose what I would do would be look for someone who is so well regarded in mainstream philosophy, but also who's written on topics of disability as a reviewer. So it might be someone who is highly medicalized disability, or someone who's thought about disability and health resource allocation. So it'll be someone who is already to some degree in the discourse, but probably someone that you would take quite a critical attitude towards. So
why? So you're saying that you would. So you're saying that that's the kind of that's the kind of reviewer that you would choose. But why would you choose that? Why would you choose that person? Why would you choose? I mean, I can't see. This is one thing that I think philosophers of disability, especially disabled philosophers of disability, come up against, is that there's a resistance and skepticism to that we repeatedly confront, that say feminist philosophers, white feminist philosophers, don't confront. I mean, no one would choose someone who is leans towards anti-feminism or I would hope that, I think that at this point in time, no one would choose someone who leans towards anti-feminism to review a book by Sally Haslanger for, for say New or Ethics or another mainstream journal. So, the question is, why would that reviewer be chosen in the first place?
So I'm suggesting it was be out of a combination of goodwill and ignorance, really, that because it's not a well-known field. But I don't want to press this. I think probably 30 years ago, someone who wrote a book of feminist philosophy may well have had the book reviewed by someone who's quite unsympathetic to it.
But we aren't where we were 30 years ago. I mean, the discipline has opened itself up to, this is the point that I make about how there have been all these measures with respect to, a variety of different underrepresented groups that disability and disabled people and disabled philosophers still remain systematically left out of, this skepticism and this, obstinance.
Fine. Okay, I understand. So I don't want to pursue it any further. Rena, I'll pass back to you for the.
Thank you. Yes, so we do have a question in the Q&A from Jorge Sanchez Perez, and Jorge thanks you for your presentation, says it was great. And Jorge writes, I was wondering about the philosophical methodology as gatekeeping. So from my work on indigenous philosophy, the most common question I face is, but how is this philosophy? And I can see how the status quo seems hell-bent on preventing disruption. What you're presenting is another disruption of that status quo, but it is one that makes philosophers seem human as possibly disabled, which would force many analytic philosophers to admit something that methodologically they have rejected. Do you think that your contribution could be seen as a deep challenge to analytic philosophical methodology as well?
Thank you very much for that question, Jorge. I mean, in one part of the introduction, I do refer to analytic methodology, and there is at least one chapter in the book, and as you would know, Kristen writes that Kristen and Samantha write about are critical of analytic ethics in their chapter. It was a fine line because in my own work, I have taken critical stances towards particular analytic philosophers, analytic bioethicists, and methodology. But at the same time, I don't want to, with this book, I don't want to, and I didn't want to undermine the, there are some analytic philosophers of disability in the book, and I don't want to undermine what they're doing because I think it's valuable. And so it's a fine line between when you're editing a book, between knowing, how much of yourself to put in it and how much you're, can shape the book, even in your introduction, how much you can shape the book as the way the book is read. So yeah, I hope that addresses your question. But I'm all for critiquing analytic methodology.
Thanks, Shelley. So while we're waiting for more questions, I'm gonna use my
Can I just say one thing, Verena?
Yes.
In terms of analytic methodology, my PhD supervisor was Les Green, who was at Oxford. He recently retired, and he is one of the most analytic philosophers. I mean, so it's not as if I'm critical from a place of being uninformed about the methodology. It's just one thing I think is that analytic philosophers do not have a robust analysis of power. That's lacking from there.
Okay.
Any questions? None.
I have a question, if that's okay.
Okay, sure. Yeah.
I mean, I have a lot of thoughts, but sort of picking up on Joe's question, I'm actually more worried that the book doesn't get reviewed at all. And so, so I'm kind of wondering, given that you're really presenting what I think is like a pretty robust challenge to philosophy as it concerns disability in particular. I'm sort of wondering why philosophy? So I'm thinking in part of Anita Allen's question in the context of, Black philosophers. So what her question is, what does philosophy have to offer to Black women philosophers in particular? And so I want to ask you the same question. And I'm not asking facetiously expecting an answer, but I'm wondering why the commitment to philosophy, in particular philosophy as a discipline, as it is, institutionalized as a profession.
I'm sorry, I'm not sure what the why is. Why is it like, why continue, or why think that you should change philosophy, or why not just leave it all together?
Yes.
Well,
Yeah.
in fact, if disabled philosophers of disability want to get a job, they have to leave philosophy because, philosophers, as I say in a part of the chapter, the introduction that I didn't read, there's never been, since Phil Jobs has been in existence, there has never been a job posted in which philosophy of disability was the area of specialization. There have been a couple in which it's been an AOC, but along with like about 6 other things. So but why philosophy? I guess to me it's been my work is concentrated on identifying the structural and infrastructural elements of philosophy, the discipline and profession that have prevented in a systematic and as Foucault would say, an intentional and non-subjective way, have kept disabled people out of academia. And so this is part of a part of the work to open up the social world to disabled people. It could be, I could have left philosophy and gone to another discipline, but I guess what's really sort of inspired me and has kept me going for the past few months at least, is I did a dialogues on disability interview with Maeve McEwen, who was a chair yesterday, and at the end of her interview, she addresses why she has stayed in philosophy, and basically she said, well, I'm not going to let them get the better of me. I'm not, if I leave, there's there won't be any more, well, as she said, there won't be any more disabled Northern Irish Catholic philosophers. And what I'm saying, I guess I would say that to me, I guess part of it is that I work with many emerging new younger disabled philosophers, and I don't want them to have to go through what I have gone through. I mean, it's people have said to me, like, why are you, why have you stuck with it? Why didn't you leave long ago? And maybe it's I've tried. I mean, it's not that easy, despite what administrators of universities want to tell you. It's not that easy for a philosopher to get a job in other disciplines. Other disciplines are very suspicious of philosophers, and when you add disability into the mix, I mean, and I should say that, you know, it's not as if philosophy is the only. I think there are discipline specific ways in which disabled people are kept out of philosophy, but it's not as if other areas of the academy are, you know, wide open to disabled people. They're not. There are barriers, different barriers all across the academy. So I'm sort of going around in circles, but so you know, when I've been asked the question, well, why have you stayed? It's just like, well, for one thing, it's not all that easy to leave, and also, you know, I'm stubborn, and you know, I'd rather try to work against something than just, you know, let somebody else have to deal with it. Oh, there's a question.
Yes, there is another question. Let me read it out. So Anna Mudda says, thanks so much, Shelley, and congratulations on the book. A bit of a messy question, picking up on Jorge's insight that philosophy of disability, perhaps more than other contestatory philosophies, humanizes philosophy. This is an invitation to say something more about your thoughts on this. I wonder what you might say about that idea in particular. This connects to the question, why philosophy, or why the commitment to philosophy? It seems to me that among other things, some human beings feel the need, that is a non-rational need, in inverted commas, to think in certain ways with certain kinds of rigor about certain kinds of questions. But this really pushes against a picture of philosophers that philosophers often have of ourselves. Might philosophy of disability be coextensive with pushing back against this, and how?
I think that I sort of feel like I addressed that in part in my long and rambling answer to what you were asking me. Let me see if there's something I can pick up on here. Yes, the why the commitment to philosophy. That's I guess I should say that well, I guess part of my answer is that it's to me I take a sort of Rortian position that philosophy is a way of it's a way of writing. It's a number of things, but one thing it is it's a way of writing, and it's a way in which I want to write, and so that's one of the reasons why I've stuck with writing in the way that I do, as opposed to, like, say, writing fiction or you know, writing purely descriptive accounts of something.
Shelley, maybe so Anna is following up and says, I think the part about humanizing philosophers seems really salient. Do you have thoughts on this idea that philosophy of disability maybe might teach philosophers something about what it means to be human that is maybe absent from, you know, philosophy as a practice of kind of rational, universal, objective?
Right. Yes. Very good. I think that yes, it does, but the way that I want to be cautious, because there's a worry that you know, would be thinking that talking about a worry that talking about you know, how philosophy of disability humanizes philosophy would mean that it you know, it allows for talk about vulnerability, pain, et cetera, and does I worry that those things could naturalize disability. And the way that I would want to emphasize the fact that disability humanizes philosophy is that it makes it draws attention to the political. I mean, humans are political, and disability is political all the way down. And so that to me is what I would want to emphasize with respect to the humanization of philosophy with respect to disability.
Wonderful. Thank you, Shelley. I'm looking at the clock and we're at 8:54, which is right on time.
Thank you so much, Farina. You've been a wonderful chair.
Thank you so much to you, Shelley, for a really fantastic paper, and to our audience for great questions, and to the organizers for running such a smooth session. Please join me in thanking Shelley and the organizers.
Thank you, everyone. Please stay for the rest of the rest of the day and the social.
Okay, thanks everyone. So we start again in 10 minutes time. So if the presenters for the next session and other presenters, if they'd like to go through the backstage door now so we can set up the tech for the next session. So we'll be back at, let me just check, make sure I get this right. I think we're back at 5 minutes past the hour, wherever you are. So see you shortly.